This is a comparison that we have been waiting a very long time to do. Two of our favorite motorcycles, getting them out on the road and comparing their specs in one video. And we've had enough of a break in the winter weather here in Colorado to actually get these bikes out on the road. So Alex is going to ride them, and I'm going to tell you everything that you need to know about the Kawasaki Z900RS and the Yamaha XSR900. Powering the Yamaha XSR900 is the latest CP3 engine from Yamaha. It's an 890cc inline 3-cylinder rated at 117 horsepower and 68 pound-feet of torque. One of the biggest differences between these two bikes is the fact that the Kawasaki has an inline 4-cylinder instead of a 3-cylinder like the Yamaha. This is 948cc, so it's also slightly bigger displacement than the XSR900, although interestingly, it's only rated at about 110 horsepower, although 73 pound-feet of torque. So this is a torquier engine than the Yamaha, but 7 fewer horsepower. And that's pretty interesting because the regular Z900 is rated at 125 horsepower, so considerably more than the MT-09 that it competes against. But when you go to the retro bikes, it's the Yamaha that's more powerful, even though this is still higher displacement.
All right, and now it is a much brighter and sunnier day, some better weather here, and it's time to get both these bikes out on the road back to back and see what they're all about, see how they ride. And we're going to start with the Yamaha, the XSR900. So let's throw a leg over and get it cranked up. Keys kind of in an unusual spot right here at the top of the tank. That'll fire up our display here, which is a pretty colorful TFT display. It looks pretty modern. And yeah, pull the clutch in and get it fired up. Alright, let's start out before we even get on the road. Look at some of our settings here. So I'm in TCS mode 2 and D mode 2, and it's super easy using this toggle right here and the mode button to cycle through everything right there. I'm probably going to leave it in D mode 2 and TCS mode 2, but these are all super customizable. So using this menu scroll wheel right here, I can scroll around and not only change what info displays where the odometer is and the fuel gauge, but I can enter into the settings here and go into manual TCS setting and basically change the manual mode. So one of the modes is mode M, and I can adjust the settings for traction control, slide control, and lift control. And then there's also a couple more settings for brake control. So it's in BC2 right now, which means cornering ABS. You can also turn it to 1, which is more of a standard ABS. I'll leave it in 2. And lastly, we have our quick shifter setting, which you can turn on or off the quick shifter, which, why the hell would you want to do that? We're leaving that on for sure. So we'll pop out of this menu, exit, and we're ready to go. So yeah, super cool screen. Might be a little small. There's a lot of black bezel around this screen right here, but it is really easy to see in the sun, and there's a lot of info there, and it's easy to use. We'll do a little acceleration pull, as I usually like to do, pull them out of our office here, and then we'll talk about what this bike is like to ride. Let's do a first gear pull. Woo! That quick shifter is pretty epic, and it is very windy today. I'm a little all over the place. So both of these bikes are retro-styled street fighters. They're both naked bikes with very powerful, sporty motors in them. And as you would imagine from two bikes that are in a competing space, they ride somewhat similarly. There's a lot of differences, but at the root of both of these bikes is a naked bike that you could last a long time on, that are just a blast to ride, both of them. And you get that exciting feeling and that exciting style out of both of these bikes. There is, of course, a big difference in engine configuration. So the Yamaha I'm on right now is a 3-cylinder. The Kawasaki is a 4-cylinder and also has a little bit more displacement, but power figures are pretty similar. But the bikes ride a little differently. This CP3, as we've talked about in some of our previous reviews, really likes to be revved out. And right now I'm kind of lugging along in second gear at about 4,000 RPM, and it's perfectly happy. It feels pretty tame. And even when you crack the throttle open, it stays tame for a little. It takes you getting up to like 6,000-7,000 RPM on this bike for it to really take off. But once you get there to 6,000 or 7,000 RPM, the bike totally wakes up and it really pushes you to crack that throttle open and ride the bike really hard. So right now I'm like 3,000 RPM. The bike feels pretty tame, but the second you get to like 6,000 RPM, the tach turns green. So it encourages you. The bike knows that it wants to be higher up in the rev range, and it tells you that right here on the dash. Let's go straight here. Oh, I love that quick shifter. Let's talk about that for a second. The tech package on this bike, because part of that is the quick shifter. And that's kind of the main difference I'm finding between these two bikes. I'll talk about the riding position too, but first let's talk about tech. So the Kawasaki we're looking at, classic styled, and it's supposed to look like a 70s bike. This bike, also classic styled, supposed to look like an 80s bike, but they take kind of two different approaches. So this Yamaha, in my eyes, is a bike that's supposed to look retro but appeal to the younger crowd, people like myself, who are used to motorcycles with ABS and traction control and wheel lift control and TFT screens and quick shifters. So you get all the modern creature comforts you would expect to find in a brand new motorcycle, but with this somewhat retro styling that doesn't go too far in the retro direction. Like this headlight is a round old school headlight, but it's LED and it's got modern touches to it and a unique design. And there's a lot of parts to this bike that have a retro style with a modern flair to it. Whereas the Kawasaki takes a totally different approach. Way less technology, basically just traction control and ABS that's barely adjustable. And old school dials for the dash and everything. So I think the Kawasaki appeals to the crowd of people that grew up riding what are now vintage bikes. The old Kawasaki's from back in the 70s that new Z900RS is styled after. They want people to get on that bike and be brought back to the old days when there weren't so many rider aids on bikes and so much technology. One of my favorite things about this new XSR900 is the handling on this bike. The front tire just feels absolutely glued to the road. And I know I could take corners a lot faster on this than I could on my older generation 2019 MT09. Not comparing this to the Kawasaki at all. The Kawasaki also feels very planted to the road at the front end, but the previous generation of these bikes that Yamaha was putting the CP3 engine into, there just always felt like there was something wrong with the chassis and the geometry of that bike, and they totally fixed that with this generation, and this really is an absolute joy to ride. I think this is a really comfortable bike too. It's just sporty enough where you can ride it pretty hard but not get worn out, and yeah, I just like the position. My legs come up higher than they would on something like an MT09 that I have in my garage, and you've got this really long tank right here. So it's a little bit of a reach to the handlebars, which again puts you in a little bit of a sportier, aggressive attack position. And it's just really enjoyable. Love this engine. And now we get to switch bikes. Take out the Kawasaki.
Another big difference between these two is how much they weigh. This Yamaha's curb weight is around 425 pounds, whereas the Kawasaki is around 474. So it's almost a 50-pound difference between these two bikes. And while we're here, we should also talk a little bit about styling, because it's a big part of what might draw people to these two particular motorcycles versus their regular modern naked bike counterparts. Of course, both of these motorcycles have retro styling details. They've got round headlights, they've got retro color schemes. I was actually surprised to see how many comments people left on the last video that we did with these two bikes about not liking the styling on this Yamaha XSR. I think it's a really sharp bike. I love the blue and gold, and I don't know, I mean, sure, you could say that this seat is a slightly awkward shape, but for the most part, I think it's a really good looking bike. There is this massive chunk of frame, and when you're looking from the front at this bike, you see a lot of that chassis. That is not my favorite bit of design, but overall there's a lot of details on this bike I like a lot. Now, this Kawasaki is definitely more retro. It's got more chrome, more bright work. This looks a lot like the sport bikes that people were riding back in the 70s, and that is what it's meant to look like. So I'll leave it to you guys to decide which motorcycle looks better, but in my personal opinion, I think they're both really sharp.
All right, now throwing a leg over the Cowie. Let's fire it up, and we'll take pretty much the same route. As you can tell, much different gauge layout here. Old school speedometer and tachometer with some info in the center. You can change the traction control mode. I'm in mode 2 right now, but that's about all you can do. You do have a gear position indicator, but a lot less technology on this bike, which isn't always a bad thing. Same thing, let's do a little acceleration run. Yeah, it's still a super powerful engine. 1000 cc is going to get you up to speed pretty quick on any bike like this, but it definitely does feel a little slower than the XSR900. And even though this is the same motor as the Z900, the RS is detuned a little bit, so not quite the same power. What is drastically different between these two bikes is the riding position. And they're both really comfortable bikes, but you definitely feel way different on these two. So first of all, is just the general body position. I feel like I'm sitting up a lot higher on this bike. The bars are a lot closer to my chest. I'm not reaching out as far. And my legs, the pegs are a lot lower to the ground. So my knees aren't quite as bent, and this is a much more relaxed, comfortable position. So if you're doing much longer rides, maybe you have like a 30-minute ride to and from work every day, this is definitely the more comfortable bike. The seat is also, I'm just gonna say it, it's the most comfortable motorcycle seat I've ever been on. The seat is just so squishy, and it has a really cool design to it too. Every time I walk up to this bike, the seat is one of the main things that catches my eye, and man, is it comfortable. It is way more comfortable than the seat on that XSR. Now when you pop on the throttle on this bike, it doesn't want to loop you into a wheelie quite like the XSR does, so it's not quite as crazy like I've been saying the XSR is, but the power band is much more usable on this bike. So even if I'm down at 3,500 RPM and I crack into the throttle, it builds very linearly, and you have a lot of usable power down low in the RPM range. So if you need to get around someone or past someone, or you're merging onto the highway, this bike is a lot less picky when it comes to what gear you're in versus that XSR. The XSR, man, it's either off or on once you hit that on point, it's all on. So you do have to be a little careful with the throttle sometimes, and you really have to be predictable. This bike, you can pay less attention to what your right hand is doing and just kind of feed it throttle, and the bike's always happy. You never really upset the bike, and there's plenty of usable power there. If you crack it wide open, this bike still hauls ass. There is a pretty notable weight difference between the Kawi and the Yamaha. This Kawasaki is almost 50 pounds heavier than that XSR900, and yes, it does have an extra cylinder, so there's a more motor underneath you that definitely weighs more. But 50 pounds is not something you can just forget about. That's a good chunk of weight that you got to lug around on this bike that you don't on the Yamaha, and you don't feel it all the time, but you know, especially when you're moving, it's a little harder to tell, but when you rock both these up off the kickstands, you can definitely feel the added weight on the Z900RS. Kawasaki, going back decades, has a history of putting inline-4 engines in upright, naked bikes like this. But at the end of the day, both these bikes are naked bikes that are made to be comfortable on the road and have crazy powerful engines. It's just the Yamaha is kind of going after the crowd of people that didn't grow up with the vintage bikes, and this is going for the people that want to be brought back to the time in their lives when they used to ride bikes with analog gauges and air cooling fins on the side of motors. These are fake, by the way. This bike, or they're just for style. This bike is liquid cooled, so yeah, pretty much every aspect of both these bikes. This is made for the older crowd that wants to remember their days spent on older motorcycles, and the XSR is more for the new crowd of people that want to be all hipster and trendy and have a vintage looking bike with everything you would come to find in a brand new sport bike.
So to wrap things up, we have to talk a little bit about price on these two bikes, and we have to say which ones we would pick. Now, for this bike, the MSRP is $11,949, and the Yamaha is $9,999. So Yamaha's a little bit more affordable.
Just a little bit, but those prices are so close. I mean, that's not going to stop you from getting the bike you really want if you're shopping for one of these two. So It really comes down to which one you like more.
Yeah, well, and that bike is new enough that it's going to be hard to find. Even if it is priced lower, you're going to have a more difficult time.
That's true, for sure. What's your pick?
I'm going to go with the Kawasaki because these bikes are largely about the style, and I really like the looks of this Z900RS. I also love the fact that it's an inline-4 because my first motorcycle was a Honda CB750, and this makes me think a lot of that.
There you go. For the same exact reasons, I'm gonna pick the XSR900. For me, it all comes down to style, and I like the 80s GP race look that this bike gives you. Both these bikes ride really nicely. Both these motors are super fun and have plenty of power, plenty of torque to get you going down the road. So if you're into spirited riding, you're gonna have a blast on both these bikes. For me, I just like the styling on this one a little more.
Yeah, so you really can't go wrong either way. These are both fantastic motorcycles, and if you're in the market for either one, I highly recommend you also ride the other because you'll find things that you like about both.